My heart stopped when Vivienne picked up my notebook. She wasn't just my fiction TA. She was the untouchable ice queen of the English department. And right then, she was staring directly at a page that was definitely not my homework. It was a secret poem. About her. I fled the classroom, absolutely terrified. But at 9:47 that night, my phone buzzed. One new email. From Vivienne. The classroom went quiet the way it always did when Vivienne crossed the room. But Amelia barely noticed. She was too busy trying to remember if she had closed her notebook before she dropped it on the desk. She hadn't. And Vivienne, who had bent down to pick it up, was now holding it open to a page that was not her homework. Amelia's heart stopped, then started again. Too fast, like a bird beating itself against a window. Amelia. Vivienne's voice was low, measured, the same voice she used to call the seminar to order, but there was something else in it now, something Amelia couldn't name. Could you stay after class for a moment? The rest of the seminar blurred into a smear of voices and shuffling backpacks. Someone asked a question about the assigned reading. Vivienne answered it in her usual crisp sentences, her round glasses perched on her nose, her dark hair pulled back in a knot that looked effortless and severe at the same time. Amelia sat frozen in the last row, her fingers wrapped around her pen so tightly that the clip left a red mark on her palm. The poem. She had written it in the margin of her notebook, squeezed between a lecture on symbolism and a doodle of a seagull she had sketched while staring out the window. 12 lines about a woman who stood by the window of her office every afternoon, watching the lake, one hand wrapped around a mug of mint tea, her shoulders carrying a weight she never let anyone see. It was the most honest thing Amelia had written all semester, and now Vivienne had read it. When the last student filed out, the door clicking shut with a soft finality, Vivienne set the notebook down on the desk. She didn't open it again. She just looked at Amelia with those steady gray eyes, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Amelia, Vivienne said again, and her voice was softer now, almost careful. We should talk. The first time Amelia saw Vivienne, she was sitting in the front row of the same seminar room 3 weeks into the fall semester. She had chosen that seat by accident, arriving early because she was nervous about finding parking, and then it was too late to move when the teaching assistant walked in, and the whole room seemed to hold its breath. Vivienne was not beautiful in the obvious way. She was beautiful in the way Winter Lake is beautiful, still, deep, and slightly dangerous if you got too close. She wore a charcoal blazer over a plain white shirt, no jewelry except a thin silver ring on her right index finger. She set her leather bag down on the lectern, looked out at the 20 students and said, I'm Vivienne Hart. I'll be your teaching assistant for the fiction workshop. I have exactly 90 minutes and very little patience for people who haven't done the reading. Someone in the back row laughed nervously. Vivienne didn't smile. Amelia fell in love with her in small increments, the way you fall into cold water. First the shock, then the slow, inevitable sinking. It happened over weeks in the way Vivienne tilted her head when she was thinking, the way she tapped her pen twice before she spoke, the way she said interesting when she meant terrible and promising when she meant something she would never say out loud. She noticed things about Vivienne that no one else seemed to notice. The way she always stood by the window during breaks, looking out at the lake. The way she drank her tea, mint, always mint, holding the mug with both hands as if she needed the warmth. The way she wore the same silver ring every day and only on her right hand. Amelia started writing the poem in late October, on a day when the sky was the color of old pewter and the lake was rough and gray. Vivienne had been standing at the window during the break, and the late afternoon light had caught the side of her face, softening the sharp lines of her jaw. Amelia had pulled out her notebook and started to write before she could stop herself. She had never shown anyone, not Rachel, not her mother, not the internet strangers she sometimes swapped poems with under a fake name. The poem was private, which was another way of saying it was true. And now it was sitting in the open on the classroom desk, and Vivienne was looking at her with those steady gray eyes, waiting for her to say something. I'm sorry, Amelia heard herself say. The words came out thin and breathless. I didn't mean to. It was a writing exercise. I was trying to describe a person. For a character sketch, that's all it was. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Vivian's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, too quick to read. She picked up the notebook and held it out to Amelia, her fingers brushing the edge of the page where the poem was written. "I'm not going to ask you about it," Vivian said, "but I do want to talk about your essay. The one on unreliable narrators. It was good, Amelia. Better than good." Amelia blinked. "It was? You have a strong voice. You undercut your own sentences sometimes, which is a habit you should break, but your instincts are solid." Vivian paused, and her gaze dropped to the notebook, then back up to Amelia's face. "I don't say that often. I'm not saying it to be kind." Amelia stood up, clutching the notebook to her chest like a shield. Her face was burning. She could feel the heat in her ears, in the backs of her hands. "Eve." "Try. Where?" "Thank you," she managed, "for the feedback. On the essay. Not the other thing." "The other thing stays between us," Vivian said quietly. She turned back to the lectern and began gathering her papers, her movements neat and deliberate. "For now." The word landed like a stone in a still pond. "For now." Amelia opened her mouth to ask what that meant, but the door opened and a student walked in, looking for her lost phone, and the moment shattered. Amelia left the classroom with her notebook pressed against her chest, the poem hidden inside it like a secret that was no longer hers alone. She walked across the quad, past the old oak trees, past the fountain where a group of freshmen were taking photos. And she didn't stop until she was back in her dorm room with the door locked. Rachel looked up from her laptop, a bag of pretzels in one hand. "Girl, you look like you just saw a ghost. What happened?" "Nothing," Amelia said too fast. I left my notebook in class, that's all." Rachel squinted at her. "Your face is the color of a tomato. That's not a left my notebook face. That's a I just did something embarrassing in front of someone I'm in love with face." Amelia threw a pillow at her. Rachel caught it, grinning. "I'm right, aren't I?" "You're not right about anything," Amelia said, but her voice cracked on the last word, and she had to turn away to hide the tears that were suddenly pressing behind her eyes. She wasn't sad. That was the strange thing. She was terrified, and relieved, and something else she couldn't name. Because Vivian had read the poem, and she hadn't laughed. She hadn't looked disgusted, or embarrassed, or even pitying. She had looked at Amelia with those steady gray eyes, and she had said, "We should talk." And then she had said, "For now." Amelia sat down on her bed, still clutching the notebook. She opened it to the page with the poem and read it again. Slowly, the words she had written in her own careful handwriting. 12 lines about a woman who stood by the window, holding her tea like a shield. 12 lines that said, without ever saying it, "I see you. I see the weight you carry. I want to know what it is." She had never wanted anyone to read those words, but now that Vivian had, Amelia realized with a small, frightening thrill that she wanted to know what Vivian thought of them. She wanted to know if Vivian had recognized herself in the lines. She wanted to know if Vivian had felt seen. The window in her dorm room faced the lake, and as the sun sank below the horizon, turning the water to a sheet of hammered gold, Amelia sat alone with her notebook and her poem, and the echo of Vivian's voice in her ears. For now, the words felt like a door, left open just a crack, and Amelia, who had spent her whole life afraid of what might be waiting on the other side of doors, found herself wanting, for the first time, to walk through. The email came at 9:47 that night. Amelia was lying on her bed, still wearing the same jeans from class, staring at the ceiling, and replaying the moment Vivian had said, "For now." Her phone buzzed on the pillow beside her, and she grabbed it with the speed of someone who had been waiting without admitting she was waiting. It was from the English department's course management system. Subject line, "Workshop 1-on-1, optional meeting." She sat up too fast, and the room tilted. The email was short, the kind of bureaucratic template that Vivian had clearly typed over, because the language was too careful to be a form letter. It said that, based on her recent workshop submissions, the instructor felt a brief one-on-one session might be helpful for clarifying her narrative direction and voice development. It suggested Thursday afternoon at 3:30 in the instructor's office. There was no mention of the notebook, no mention of the poem, no mention of the word for now. Amelia read it 3 times, then called Rachel. "She emailed me," she said the moment Rachel picked up. "Who? The Ice Queen?" Rachel's voice was muffled, like she had a chip in her mouth. "What'd she say?" "She wants to meet, one-on-one, Thursday." "Oh, honey." Rachel swallowed audibly. "That's either really good or really bad." "Did she say anything about the poem?" "No." "Then it's really good or really bad. You'll have to go and find out." Amelia hung up, feeling worse than before she called. Rachel meant well, but Rachel also thought every situation could be fixed by saying the right thing at the right volume. And Amelia had never once in her life said the right thing at the right volume. Thursday arrived the way bad weather arrives, slowly, then all at once. Amelia spent the morning in the library, not reading, just sitting in a carrel on the 4th floor with her notebook open and her pen uncapped, trying to prepare herself for whatever Vivienne might say. She imagined a dozen conversations, each one worse than the last. In the worst version, Vivienne handed the notebook back with a flat expression and said, "I think you should consider dropping the workshop." In the slightly less bad version, Vivienne said, "I won't mention this to anyone, but I need you to understand that this is inappropriate." In the best version, which Amelia barely allowed herself to think, Vivienne said something kind, but she couldn't picture it. Vivienne's kindness was rare thing to adult in small practical measures, like the way she would nod at a student who finally cracked a difficult passage, or the way she once told the whole class that Amelia's metaphor about the lake had real resonance. That was 3 weeks ago, and Amelia had lived on the memory ever since. At 3:15, she stood outside the English department office door. The building was old, with high ceilings and radiators that clanked even in April. The hallway smelled like dust and old paper and a faint trace of someone's coffee. Vivienne's office was at the end of the corridor, the one with the frosted glass window and the small brass nameplate that read V. Ashford, Ph.D. candidate. Amelia knocked. A pause. Then from inside a voice that made her stomach turn over. "Come in." The office was small and neat, the way Vivienne kept everything. There was a desk with a tidy stack of papers, a bookshelf that held more literary journals than books, and a single window that faced the lake. The late afternoon light came through it in a long, pale rectangle, falling across the floor and the edge of the desk. Vivienne was sitting behind the desk, wearing a gray sweater with the sleeves pushed up, and she had her reading glasses on. Amelia had never seen her wear them before, and the sight was so unexpectedly soft that she almost forgot to close the door behind her. "Have a seat," Vivienne said, gesturing to the chair across from the desk. She didn't smile, but her voice was not cold either. It was neutral, careful, the voice of someone who was choosing her words in advance. Amelia sat down, clutching her notebook to her chest like a shield. "I asked you here because I want to talk about your work," Vivienne said, folding her hands on the desk. "Not your poem, your work." Amelia's heart, which had been pounding since she knocked, did something strange. It slowed. Not because she was relieved, but because Vivienne's tone was so deliberate, so even, that it felt like standing in the eye of a storm. "Your last piece," Vivienne continued, "the one about the woman who keeps a garden at night. I think you're holding back." Amelia blinked. "Holding back?" "Your narrator is smart, observant, but she never lets the reader close. She describes everything perfectly and feels nothing. Or rather, she feels a lot, but she's afraid to say it directly." Vivienne looked at her over the top of her glasses. "Do you know what I mean?" Amelia did know. She knew exactly what she meant. It was the same thing her professors had been saying for 2 years, in different words, with different degrees of patience. "You're good, but you're safe. You hide behind precision." "I'm working on it," she said quietly. Vivienne nodded, then reached for a folder on the corner of her desk. She opened it, and Amelia saw her own handwriting on the pages inside, the workshop piece from last week. "I made some notes," Vivienne said. "Nothing about your poem, just notes on the craft. Would you like to hear them?" Amelia nodded, and Vivienne began to read. She read the notes in a low, even voice, pointing out where a sentence could be tightened, where a metaphor was doing double work, where Amelia had repeated a word 3 times in 2 paragraphs without noticing. It was the most useful feedback she had ever received, and it was also the most terrifying, because Vivienne had clearly read the piece more than once. She had read it the way you read something you care about. When she finished, she closed the folder and looked at Amelia. "You have a strong voice," she said. "I told you to think before. But a strong voice can still be afraid, and right now, yours is." Amelia's throat tightened. She wanted to say something clever, something that would prove she was brave and unbothered and ready to take the feedback and run with it. Instead, she heard herself say, unexpectedly, "I wrote the poem because I couldn't figure out how to say it in prose." The room went very quiet. Vivienne's expression didn't change. She set the folder down very slowly and folded her hands on top of it. She looked at Amelia for a long moment, and Amelia felt the weight of that gaze like a hand pressing on her chest. "That's the most honest thing you've said in this office," Vivienne said finally. "I'm glad you told me." Amelia's face went hot. She looked down at her notebook, at the cover with its worn corners, and wished she could disappear into the floorboards. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I didn't mean to." "You didn't do anything wrong," Vivienne said, and then, quieter, almost to herself, "Sometimes the thing we can't say in prose is the only thing worth saying." She took off her glasses and set them on the desk. Without them, her face looked younger, less guarded. She was just a person, sitting in a small office with the lake light coming through the window. And for a moment, Amelia felt like she was seeing her for the first time. "I want you to try something," Vivienne said. "For the next workshop piece, I want you to write the thing you're afraid to write. Not a poem, prose. And I want you to let it be messy, let it be ugly, let it be true." Amelia's hands were shaking a little, but she nodded. "Can you do that?" "I can try," she said. Vivienne smiled. It was a small, quick thing, gone almost before it appeared, but it was real, and it was aimed at her. "That's all I asked," she said. The meeting ended a few minutes later. Vivienne walked her to the door and held it open, and as Amelia stepped into the hallway, she heard Vivienne's voice, low and quiet, just behind her shoulder. "For what it's worth," Vivienne said, "I thought your poem was very good." Amelia turned around, but the door was already closing and Vivienne was already back at her desk, reaching for her glasses, looking down at the papers in front of her. The words hung in the air like a held breath. Amelia walked down the hallway, out of the building, and into the cold April evening. Her heart was pounding again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was something else, something she didn't have a name for yet. She walked to the lake and stood at the railing, watching the water go dark under the fading sky, and she let herself think about what Vivienne had said. "I thought your poem was very good." She repeated it to herself like a line from a poem she was memorizing, like a line she wanted to keep. The assignment sat on Amelia's desk like a small, patient animal waiting to be fed. She had printed it out the night before, folded it once, and tucked it under her keyboard so she would have to look at it every time she sat down to work. Write about the thing you are afraid to write about. Let it be messy, let it be ugly, let it be true. She had read those 3 sentences so many times that they had lost their meaning, which is probably the point. Vivienne knew exactly what she was doing. She had given Amelia a locked door and told her to find the key, knowing full well that Amelia had been standing outside that door for years, pretending it didn't exist. On Thursday morning, Amelia woke up with the assignment still sitting in her chest like a stone. She made her tea, fed the goldfish, crackers to her roommate's cat, and sat down at her desk with her notebook open to a blank page. She stared at it for a long time. She knew what she was afraid to write about. She had known for weeks now, ever since the first day of the semester when Vivienne had walked into the workshop wearing a black turtleneck and a pair of silver earrings, looking like she had stepped out of a novel Amelia had read too many times. The fear had a name, and a face, and a voice that said things like, "I thought your poem was very good," in a low, quiet tone that made Amelia's stomach do something she refused to name. She couldn't write about that. She couldn't write a single word about that. So she did what she always did when she couldn't write. She cleaned her room. She organized her bookshelf alphabetically, then by color, then back to alphabetical. She washed her mug 3 times. She checked her phone, put it down, picked it up again. She thought about the poem, the real one, the one in the notebook that Vivienne had read, and she thought about what Vivienne had said after the door closed. "I thought your poem was very good." Amelia had replayed those words so many times that they had started to feel worn, like a favorite sweatshirt, but she still didn't know what to do with them. You couldn't say thank you to a closed door. You couldn't write a poem back. You could only sit in your room and think about how her voice sounded when she said your poem, like the words belonged to both of them. By Friday afternoon, Amelia had written exactly 4 sentences of her assignment, and all 4 of them were about the weather. She was walking back from the library when the idea came to her. It wasn't a grand idea. It was small and simple and slightly embarrassing, which was how she knew it was.
Right. Vivienne's office was in the old humanities building. On the 3rd floor, at the end of a hallway that always smelled like old paper and floor wax. Amelia had walked past it a dozen times, telling herself she wasn't hoping to catch a glimpse of her through the narrow window in the door. She knew the office hours by heart, even though she had only ever attended one of them. She also knew that Vivienne drank mint tea. It was a small detail, the kind you noticed when you were paying too much attention to someone. The office had a little electric kettle on the windowsill, and a tin of loose-leaf mint tea that Vivienne refilled from a shop on Wabash Avenue. Amelia had seen the tin once, on the day of the first meeting, and she had never forgotten it. So on Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock, Amelia walked to the coffee shop 2 blocks from campus, bought a large cup of mint tea and a small packet of peppermints, and carried them across campus with her heart beating too fast for no reason at all. She told herself this wasn't weird, it was just a nice thing. A thank you, sort of, for the poem comment. For the assignment even, in a strange way, for saying your voice is afraid, which had felt like being seen for the first time in a long time. She walked up the 3 flights of stairs, down the hallway that smelled like old paper and floor wax, and stopped in front of Vivienne's door. The light was on. She could hear the soft click of a keyboard from inside. Amelia set the cup of tea on the floor, right next to the door. She placed the packet of peppermints on top of the lid. She straightened, looked at the door, and almost knocked. Her hand hovered in the air for a long moment. Then she turned around and walked away as quickly as she could without running. She was halfway down the hallway when she heard the door open behind her. She didn't turn around. She kept walking, her heart pounding, her face burning, her hands shoved deep into her pockets. She heard a pause, a small, quiet sound, like someone noticing something they hadn't expected to find. Then the door closed again, soft and careful, and Amelia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That night, Amelia sat at her desk and stared at her blank page. She had eaten dinner, watched 2 episodes of a show she wasn't really watching, and checked her email 11 times. There was nothing new, which was what she had expected, which didn't stop her from feeling a small, stupid ache of disappointment. She was about to close her laptop when she noticed the notification. 1 new message. From Vivienne Ashford. Amelia's heart did a thing that she refused to call a jump. She clicked it open. The subject line was blank. The message was short. It said, "Thank you for the tea. And the mints. That was very kind." Amelia read it 3 times. She was waiting for something else. A question, a hint, a confirmation that Vivienne knew exactly who had left the tea. But there was nothing else. Just those 2 sentences, clean and simple, like everything Vivienne wrote. She closed the email, opened it again, closed it. Then she picked up her pen and wrote, for the first time in 3 days, a sentence that wasn't about the weather. It was about a woman who drank mint tea and wore round glasses and said your poem was very good, in a voice that sounded like it meant something. It was the first honest thing Amelia had written since the poem. She wrote until 11 o'clock, and when she finally stopped, her hand was cramped and her eyes were tired and the page was full. She didn't read it back. She didn't want to know yet what she had written. She just closed the notebook, put it under her pillow, and lay awake for a long time, thinking about the sound of a door closing soft and careful, like it was being handled with care, like something precious had been left on the doorstep, and someone had picked it up. The workshop room was empty by the time Amelia finished packing her bag. She had stayed late on purpose, pretending to reread a handout about comma splices, waiting for the room to clear so she wouldn't have to walk out with anyone. It was a Thursday, which meant Vivienne held office hours until 6, and Amelia had spent the entire week convincing herself she did not need to go. The email had said thank you. That was enough. It had to be enough. And yet here she was, standing outside the door to Vivian's office, her hand raised halfway to knock, her heart doing something uncomfortable in her chest. She had a draft with her, the one she had written under her pillow, the one full of sentences about a woman who drank mint tea and wore round glasses. It was not ready. It was barely even a draft. But the assignment was due in 2 days, and Vivian had offered to look at early versions, and Amelia had run out of excuses. The door opened before she could knock. Vivian was standing there in a gray sweater with the sleeves pushed up to her elbows, her round glasses perched low on her nose, a pencil tucked behind one ear. She looked, for a fraction of a second, almost surprised. Then her face settled into its usual calm, and she stepped aside and said, "I was wondering when you'd show up." Amelia's mouth went dry. "You were?" Vivian walked back to her desk and sat down, gesturing to the chair across from her. "You've been circling the hallway for 10 minutes. I could hear your footsteps." There was no mockery in her voice, just a statement, simple and dry, the way Vivian said most things. Amelia felt her face heat as she sat down, clutching her notebook to her chest like a shield. "I wasn't circling. I was gathering my thoughts." "Right," Vivian's mouth twitched. The barest hint of a smile, and then she held out her hand. "Let me see it." Amelia hesitated. The draft was full of her. All of her. Every line was a confession, disguised in metaphor and weather, and the way light fell across a desk at 4 in the afternoon. She had tried to make it vague, but she knew. She knew. "It's not ready," she said. "It's really rough. I'm not grading it. I'm just looking." Vivian's hand stayed out, patient. "That's the deal, remember? You show me early drafts, I give you notes. You don't have to be perfect." Amelia swallowed and handed over the notebook, opened to the page where the draft began. Vivian took it without ceremony, adjusting her glasses, and began to read. The silence that followed was the longest of Amelia's life. She watched Vivian's eyes move across the page, line by line, and tried to read her face for clues. There were none. Vivian read the way she did everything, completely, without distraction. As if the rest of the world had stopped existing. Her expression stayed neutral. Her fingers resting on the edge of the notebook did not move. And then at some point, something shifted. It was small. A flicker. The way her eyebrows drew together, just slightly, and the way her lips parted, just barely, like she had read something she hadn't expected. Amelia's heart lurched. "That's a strong image," Vivian said, her voice quieter than before. "The one about the window." Amelia's hands were cold. "Thank you." Vivian clicked up. Her eyes behind the round glasses were unreadable, but there was something there now, something that hadn't been there a moment ago. A crack, a pause, a question she wasn't asking. "This is about someone specific," Vivian said. It wasn't a question. Amelia's throat closed. She opened her mouth to deny it, to say, "No, it's just a persona exercise, it's just a character study," but the words wouldn't come. Because they both knew. They both knew, and pretending felt like a lie, and Amelia was so tired of lying. She started, and then stopped. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her knees. It's a draft. It's not—" "Amelia," Vivian's voice was soft. "It's okay. I'm not asking you to explain it." The silence came back, but it was different now. Warmer. Amelia could hear the clock on the wall ticking, the distant sound of a door closing somewhere down the hall, the soft creak of the old building settling around them. She could hear her own breathing, too loud in her ears. She was about to say something, anything, when Vivian leaned forward to point at a line on the page. Her chair scraped against the floor, and she shifted closer, reaching across the desk to tap the paper with the eraser end of her pencil. "Here," she said, "this comma should be a period. The sentence is strong enough to stand alone." She was close. Too close. Amelia could smell her perfume, something clean and faintly floral, and see the tiny mole just below her left ear, and notice for the first time that she had a small scar on her index finger, pale and old.
Vivian's hand hovered over the page for a second too long, and then she looked up, and their eyes met. The room went very still. Amelia forgot to breathe. The air between them felt thick, charged, like the moment before a storm. Vivian's gaze was steady, unreadable, and Amelia could see her own reflection in the glass of her glasses, small and lost and terrified. And then, somewhere in the distance, Amelia's phone rang. The sound shattered everything. Vivian pulled back immediately, straightening up, adjusting her glasses. Amelia fumbled for her phone, her face burning, and saw Rachel's name on the screen. She wanted to throw it across the room. She wanted to answer it and scream. Instead, she pressed the button to silence it and shoved the phone back in her bag. "Sorry," she said, her voice too high. It's just my roommate." Vivian had already turned back to the draft, her expression smooth and composed as if nothing had happened. But her hand, resting on the edge of the desk, was trembling. Just a little, just barely. "She sounds enthusiastic," Vivian said mildly. "Calling you at this hour must be a good friend." Amelia nodded, still flustered. She's a lot, but she means well." "She's lucky." Amelia blinked. "Sorry?" Vivian looked up, and for a moment her guard slipped, just a fraction. Just enough for Amelia to see something raw underneath, something tired and lonely and very, very human. "To have someone who calls you at this hour, who cares enough to check on you." She paused. "She's lucky to have you." Amelia's heart stopped. Vivian looked away, back at the draft, and the moment passed. But Amelia couldn't unhear it. She couldn't unsee the way Vivian's voice had dropped, soft and almost wistful, like she was talking about something she'd never had. They spent the next 20 minutes going over the draft. Vivian's notes were precise and helpful, her voice steady, her focus absolute. She didn't bring up the image of the window again. She didn't ask who the poem was about, but when Amelia finally stood to leave, her notebook clutched to her chest, Vivian cleared her throat. "Amelia." She turned. Vivian was still sitting at her desk, her round glasses catching the light, her face unreadable. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she picked up her pencil and said, "Keep writing, you're getting closer." Closer to what? She didn't say. Amelia didn't ask. She walked out of the office on unsteady legs, crossed the empty hallway, and made it all the way to the parking lot before she stopped and pressed her hand to her chest where her heart was still pounding, still racing, still repeating the same two words over and over. "She's lucky. She's lucky. She's lucky." Amelia drove home in a daze. Rachel was waiting in the living room with a bag of chips and an expectant look, and Amelia told her everything, leaving out only the part about the comma and the leaning in, and the way Vivian's hand had trembled on the desk. She told her about the email, about the draft, about the line about the window. She told her about the perfume and the mole and the scar. She did not tell her about the moment, the one when the air had gone thick and the room had gone still, and she had seen her own reflection in Vivian's glasses. That night, Amelia lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and could not sleep. She kept hearing it, the soft, almost wistful way Vivian had said it, the pause before it, the way she had looked away afterward like she had said too much. "She's lucky." Amelia pressed her face into her pillow and tried not to think about what it meant. She failed. She thought about it until 2 in the morning, until the words had worn grooves into her brain, until she knew she would never be able to think them again without remembering the exact shade of Vivian's eyes in the lamplight. And somewhere, across the city, in a small office on the 3rd floor of the English building, Vivian sat with her glasses off and her head in her hands, staring at a page of notes she had not written, thinking about a line about a window, and a girl who had looked at her like she was the answer to a question she hadn't been brave enough to ask. The week after the office hour passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Amelia went to class. She took notes. She did not look at Vivian any more than she had to, which meant she looked at her exactly the same amount as always, which was to say constantly, but with more guilt attached. She handed in her final portfolio on a Thursday morning, slipping it into the pile on Vivian's desk without meeting her eyes. The portfolio had taken her 11 days to write. It contained 3 short stories, 1 personal essay, and a poem she had revised so many times the margins had begun to crumble. She had not written anything about windows. She had been very, very careful about that. Rachel found her in the dormitory common room that afternoon, staring at her phone like it might spontaneously combust.
Did you hand it in? Rachel asked, dropping onto the couch beside her.
Yes. And did you write anything that will get you flagged by the University Ethics Committee?
No, Amelia said, and then, because she could not help herself, I don't think so. Rachel raised one eyebrow. That's not a no.
It's a probably no.
Girl, Rachel stole a piece of popcorn from the bowl on Amelia's lap. You need to do something about this. The pining is getting pathetic. Amelia did not have a response to that. Because it was true. She spent the weekend avoiding her think thoughts. She went to the lake, she fed the gulls, she drank too much Earl Grey and wrote a poem about a lighthouse that was not about Vivian at all, except for the part where it was. By Sunday night, she had convinced herself that the portfolio would come back with a polite, professional note, something like, "Good work this semester, see you at the final." She had also convinced herself that this was fine. The email came on Tuesday afternoon. It was not from the department, it was from Vivian's personal university account, the one she only used for students who had been given special permission to contact her directly. Amelia had been given that permission 3 weeks ago for a reason she could no longer remember, and she had never once used it. Now she stared at the subject line, portfolio, feedback. She opened it with her eyes half shut. The body of the email was 2 sentences long. Your work is ready to be picked up. I left it in your campus mailbox. As you have office hours conflict this week, if you are free on Thursday after class, I would like to discuss one of the pieces with you. Amelia read it 4 times. The first time, she felt relief. The second time, she felt confusion. The third time, she noticed the word discuss. The fourth time, she noticed that Vivian had not signed her name. She walked to the English building at 4 o'clock when she knew the halls would be empty. The mailbox was in a narrow corridor on the 2nd floor, a row of metal slots with names taped above them. Hers was near the end. She pulled out the portfolio, a thick manila folder, heavier than she remembered, and carried it back to her dormitory without opening it. Rachel was not there. Good. Amelia sat on her bed, placed the folder on her knees, and took a breath. The third page was her personal essay. On it, in the margins, in handwriting she had only ever seen in red pen before, there was a note, then another, then another. She flipped through the essay, and every single page had multiple notes. Some were about craft, some were about structure, some were just single words, underlining a phrase Amelia had written without thinking much about it, and beside them, one word, yes. She turned to the short stories. More notes. More margin comments. One of them was nearly a paragraph long, about the way Amelia had handled the pacing in the 2nd story, and it ended with the sentence, "This is the kind of control most writers spend years trying to develop. You already have it." Amelia's hands were shaking. She reached the final piece, the poem, the one she had revised so carefully, the one that was not about windows. She had written it about a woman who kept her office lights on late, who drank tea that smelled like mint, who closed her eyes when she was thinking about something hard. It was not about windows. It was not. At the bottom of the page, there was an entire page of handwriting. Not a margin note, a full page, attached to the back of the poem with a paperclip, covered in Vivian's careful, slanted script. Amelia read it once. Then she read it again. Then she put the page down, picked it up, and read it a 3rd time. The letter said, I have been sitting here for an hour trying to write this in the language of a feedback session, and I have decided that is dishonest, so I will write it plainly. I know what it costs to write something true. I know what it costs to hand it to someone and wait for them to judge it. I have been writing poems for 8 years, and I have never let a single person read one of them, not even my advisor. Again, even my mother. I'm telling you this because your poem made me feel less alone. That is not something I say to students. I have never said it to a student. I am saying it to you because I think you need to hear it, and because I think you are old enough to carry it. Whatever you are afraid of, Amelia, I recognize it. I carry it too. Amelia did not realize she was crying until a tear landed on the page. She read the letter again, and then she read the last line. I carry it too. Until the words stopped making sense and became just shapes on the page, and then until they made sense again, and then she read it one more time. She slept with the letter under her pillow. She does not remember falling asleep. On Thursday, she stood outside the classroom after the lecture ended, waiting until every other student had filed out. Vivian was at the front, stacking papers, her back half turned. She was wearing her round glasses. There was a cup of mint tea on the corner of her desk, steam rising in a thin curl. Amelia walked forward. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. Vivian looked up. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room was empty. The light summed. "I read your letter," Amelia said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Vivian set down the papers. "I wrote it carefully. I meant every word." "I know." Amelia took a breath. "I have other poems. I write a lot of them. Most of them are not very good. Some of them are about—" She stopped. She could feel her face heating up. "They're about things I don't usually show people." Vivian's expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted, softer, like a door opening a crack. "I would like to read them," Vivian said, "if you want to show me." Amelia stood there, in the home 50 classroom, with the hum of the lights and the smell of mint tea and the weight of every word she had ever written pressing against her ribs. "Okay," she said. "Yes, Yes." Vivian nodded. And then, so quietly Amelia almost missed it, she said, "I'll look forward to it." Amelia walked out of the classroom and down the hall and out of the building, and she did not feel the ground under her feet at all. She felt like she was made of light. She felt like she had handed someone the key to every locked room inside her, and instead of running away, the person had simply said, "Thank you. I'll take good care of it." She was still floating when she got back to the dormitory. Rachel took one look at her face and said, "Oh no. What happened?" Amelia smiled so wide her cheeks hurt. "Nothing," she said. "Nothing happened at all." But that night, she sat on her bed with her notebook open, and she wrote 11 lines about a woman who wore round glasses and kept her tea warm with both hands. And for the first time, she did not feel afraid of the words. She felt like they were a bridge. The week after Amelia handed Vivian her other poems passed in a strange, suspended haze. They exchanged emails about craft and line breaks, and the way a poem could hold two feelings at once. And every message felt like a small, private door opening somewhere inside her. She did not ask for more. She was learning to be grateful for what she had. Then, on a gray Tuesday afternoon, the door closed. Amelia was walking past the English department office when she saw them through the half-open door. Vivian stood at her desk, her back straight, her voice low and clipped. Across from her stood Professor Hartley, a silver-haired man with a kind face and a sharp way of saying things that sounded picked to this, but were not. "I'm not suggesting anything improper," he was saying, his tone light, almost amused. "I'm just saying be careful. You're young, she's young, and you're her TA. Perception matters." Vivian's jaw tightened. "My interactions with my students are professional." "Of course they are," Professor Hartley smiled. "But I've seen you stay late with her. I've seen the emails. And I know you, Vivian. You don't do that for just anyone." Amelia's stomach dropped. She stepped back from the door before either of them could see her, her heart hammering so loud she was sure the whole hallway could hear it. She walked away quickly, her shoes squeaking on the linoleum, and she did not stop until she was outside, standing in the cold wind by the lake. She had known, of course. She had known that what she felt was not something a student should feel about a TA. She had known that every late conversation, every shared silence, every small kindness was a line they were both dancing around. But hearing it spoken aloud in that amused, careful voice made it real in a way she had not been ready for. She had done this. She had made Vivian vulnerable. She had made her look like someone who played favorites, someone who could be talked about in hallways. That night, she did not email Vivian. She did not write. She sat on her bed with her notebook closed on her lap, and she stared at the wall until Rachel came in with a bag of chips and said, "Okay, spill," Amelia told her. She told her about the door and the voice and the words, "Perception matters." She told her about the way Vivian's jaw had tightened, the way she had looked cornered. Rachel listened, chewing slowly. Then she said, "That's not your fault." "It is, though," Amelia said quietly. "I'm the one who—" She said, "No." She could not say it. "You're the one who wrote a poem," Rachel said. "That's not a crime. and she's the one who chose to respond. That's not a crime either. People are just scared of anything that looks real." Amelia did not answer. She lay back on her bed and stared at the ceiling, and she felt something she had not felt in weeks. Shame. Not for the poem, not for the feelings, but for having put Vivienne in a position where someone could look at her and say, "Be careful." The next day, Vivienne's emails stopped coming. Amelia checked her inbox 3 times in the morning, then twice after lunch, then once more before bed. Nothing. She told herself it was fine. Vivienne was busy. It was midterm season. She had other students, other papers, other lives. But on Thursday, when Vivienne walked into the workshop, she did not look at Amelia. She taught the class with her usual precision, her voice steady and cool. But her eyes moved over the room like a searchlight that deliberately skipped one corner. Amelia sat in that corner, and she felt herself becoming invisible. After class, she lingered at her desk, pretending to pack her bag. She waited until the other students filtered out. She waited until it was just the 2 of them, and the hum of the fluorescent lights. "Vivienne?" she said softly. Vivienne paused. She did not turn around fully, just tilted her head slightly, a half gesture that said, "I'm listening, but I'm already leaving." "I heard," Amelia stopped. "I was outside the office. On Tuesday, I heard what Professor Hartley said." Something flickered across Vivienne's face, then it was gone, smooth and blank as glass. "You shouldn't have been listening." "I wasn't trying to. I was walking past." "Amelia?" Vivienne's voice was level, careful, almost kind.
This. It's nothing. Just focus on your work. You're a good writer. That's what matters." It was the first time she had called her a good writer and meant it as a goodbye. Amelia stood there for a long moment, her hands gripping the strap of her bag. She wanted to say something. She wanted to explain that she had not meant to cause trouble, that she would back away, that she would do anything to undo the look on Vivienne's face. But the words would not come. They sat in her throat like stones. "Okay," she said finally. "I'm sorry." She walked out of the classroom, and she did not look back. She did not see the way Vivienne's hands were shaking as she gathered her papers. She did not see the way Vivienne pressed her palm flat against the desk and closed her eyes, as if she was steadying herself against something she had been running from for a long time. Amelia walked back to the dormitory in the cold wind, and she wrote an email that night. It took her an hour to get the words right. "Hi, Vivienne. I'm sorry for the other day. I didn't mean to make things awkward, and I definitely didn't mean to cause you any trouble. I want you to know that I understand if you need to keep things professional. I respect that. I respect you. I'll back off. You don't have to worry about me." She read it 3 times. Then she deleted it. She wrote a second version, shorter this time. "I'm sorry, I'll back off." She deleted that one too. In the end, she sent nothing. She closed her laptop and lay in the dark, and she felt the poem she had written about the woman with round glasses hardening inside her like a scar. She had given Vivienne the key to every locked room inside her, and now the door was closing, and she did not know how to take the key back. She did not sleep that night. She lay, awake, listening to the wind off the lake, and she thought about how she had been so afraid of being seen, but she had never once thought about what it cost the person doing the seeing. The next morning, she found an email in her inbox. It was from the department office. It was a generic reminder about upcoming deadlines sent to all students. It was not from Vivienne. It was not even addressed to her. She closed the laptop and went to class, and she did not check her inbox again for 3 days. The week Amelia's grandmother went into the hospital, the sky over Chicago did something strange. It stayed gray for 4 days straight, not raining, just pressing down on the city like a held breath. Amelia packed a small bag and took the Amtrak south to Springfield without telling anyone except Rachel, who stood in the doorway of their dorm room holding a bag of jalapeno chips and looking uncharacteristically serious. "Text me when you get there," Rachel said, "even if it's just a period, even if it's just a dot." Amelia nodded. She did text, 1 dot, and Rachel replied with a single heart emoji and nothing else. It was the most restrained Rachel had ever been, and Amelia loved her for it. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and wilting flowers. Her grandmother, who had taught her the word imagery when she was 9, who had read her poems at the kitchen table and never once said, "That's nice, dear," without meaning it, lay in a bed that seemed too big for her. Her hands were thin, her voice came out scratchy. "Amelia, girl," she said, "you brought your notebook?" Amelia laughed. Because she had, of course. Because she always did. She pulled it out of her bag, the same one with the coffee ring on the cover and the bent corner where she had shoved it into her backpack, too, fast. Her grandmother smiled and closed her eyes, and Amelia sat beside her and wrote. The poem she wrote that night was not about Vivienne. It was about the color of hospital curtains and the sound of a heartbeat monitor, about the way you love someone and also grieve them while they are still alive, because you can see the shape of the ending coming and you cannot stop it. She wrote it in one draft. She did not revise it. She did not check her email for 6 days. On the 7th day, her grandmother was moved out of the ICU and into a regular room. The doctor said the word stable with a cautious optimism that Amelia clung to like a rope. She sat in the cafeteria with a cup of vending machine tea and finally opened her laptop. The Wi-Fi was slow, the screen loaded in pieces. There were 47 unread emails. 32 of them were department-wide announcements. 11 were from Rachel, each one funnier than the last. 3 were from her mother about insurance forms. 1 was from the university bookstore about a sale on highlighters. And then there was the one that made her stop. It was from Vivienne's university email address. The subject line was, "Course Materials, Week 7, no reply needed." Amelia's heart did something complicated in her chest. She clicked it. The email was short, clinical. It listed the readings for the week, the lecture slides attached as a PDF, and a note that the workshop would be peer critique only, no submissions due. It was the kind of email a TA sent to all students when they missed a class. It was perfectly professional. But at the bottom, just below the signature line, in handwriting that Amelia had seen only once before at the edge of a margin on a workshop draft, there was a line. It was not in the body of the email. It was not part of the official message. It was a small white card photographed and attached as an image. The handwriting was neat, the letters slightly slanted from years of fountain pens. "Don't rush to reply. Take care of yourself first." Amelia stared at the screen until the words went blurry. Then she blinked and they came back into focus. She read the sentence again, then again. The card was not signed. It did not need to be. When she opened the attached PDF later that night, after her grandmother had fallen asleep, she found that the lecture notes were not the standard template she had seen in the shared drive. They were typed in a different font. There were additional annotations in the margins, small explanations of the readings, clarifications of terms. It was the kind of preparation that took hours. Amelia printed the whole thing at the nurse's station and read it twice. She did not cry. She felt like she might, but she did not. She wrote a reply in her head, a dozen different versions. "Thank you. I'm okay. I miss the workshop. I miss your voice. I keep rereading the last line of the poem I wrote about you, and I don't know if it's good enough." That last one she did not even let herself think to the end. She closed the laptop and went back to the hospital room. Her grandmother woke at 2 a.m. and asked for water. Amelia helped her sit up and held the cup to her lips. Her grandmother looked at her with those eyes that had seen her grow from a child who wrote about unicorns into a woman who wrote about wanting to be known. "You have a good heart, Amelia girl," her grandmother said. "Don't let the world make you forget that." Amelia held her hand until she fell back asleep. She did not sleep herself. She sat in the dark and thought about gray skies and hospital curtains and a small white card with handwriting that was not signed. The week passed. Her grandmother improved, then plateaued, then improved again. The doctors used the word recovering with more confidence. Amelia's mother told her she could go back to school. Her grandmother kissed her forehead and said, "Go, write something good." Amelia took the train back to Chicago on a Sunday evening. The sky was clear for the first time in 8 days. She sat on the platform with her bag and her notebook and the printed PDF tucked into her folder, and she felt something she had not felt in weeks. It was not hope, exactly. It was smaller than hope. It was the quiet knowledge that someone had seen her absence and had not let her slip through the cracks unnoticed. Monday morning, she walked into the English building. The hallway was busy, students rushing to classes, the smell of coffee and old paper. She turned the corner toward the workshop room and saw Vivienne standing by the door, holding a stack of papers, talking to another student. Vivienne looked tired. There were shadows under her eyes that Amelia had never noticed before. She was wearing a dark green sweater and her round glasses, and she had a paper coffee cup in her hand that she was not drinking from. The other student left. Vivienne turned and their eyes met. The hallway noise faded into something distant, like a radio turned down low. Amelia stopped walking. Vivienne's hand tightened slightly on the stack of papers, and for a second neither of them moved. Then Vivienne spoke. Her voice was quiet, careful, stripped of the professional distance that had marked the last 2 weeks. "You're back," she said. It was not a question. Amelia nodded. She could feel her own pulse in her throat. She wanted to say 100 things. She wanted to ask if Vivienne had thought about her. She wanted to thank her for the notes. She wanted to say, "I'm sorry, and I don't know what for, and I missed you, and I don't know if I'm allowed to say that." What she said instead, because she was who she was, "Yeah, I'm back." Vivienne looked at her for a long moment. The corner of her mouth twitched, a fraction of a movement, almost too small to see. Then she nodded and gestured with the coffee cup toward the classroom door. "The workshop's about to start," she said. "You're going to be late." She turned and walked into the room. Amelia stood in the hallway for a second longer, her heart beating too fast, and she watched the empty doorway where Vivienne had been standing. She had not said, "I'm glad you're back." She had not said, "I missed you." But she had not said the other thing either, the professional thing, the good to have you caught up thing. She had said, "You're back," like it mattered. Amelia took a breath and followed her into the room. The notice went up on the department bulletin board on a Tuesday morning, printed on plain white paper and pinned slightly crooked, as if whoever had hung it had been in a hurry. Amelia saw it between her 9 a.m. lecture and her creative writing seminar. She was walking past the English department office, not thinking about anything in particular, when a cluster of students near the board made her slow down. Someone said, "Wait, Vivienne Ashford is going to England?" Amelia stopped walking. The paper was titled Graduate Student Fellowship Announcement. There was a list of names, but her eyes went straight to the one near the top, in bold type, next to a small university crest, Vivienne Ashford, Visiting Research Fellowship, University of Oxford. 1. Academic year. She read it twice, then a third time, because the words didn't change, and she needed them to change. The rest of the morning was a blur. She sat through her creative writing seminar in the back row, her notebook open, her pen uncapped, and she did not write a single word. The professor was talking about narrative voice in third-person fiction, and Amelia heard none of it. She kept looking at the front of the room, at the empty chair where Vivienne sometimes sat during lectures, and she thought, 1 academic year. She's going to be gone for 1 academic year. She had known, of course, that Vivienne was a doctoral candidate, that her time at the university was finite, but knowing something in the abstract and watching it become real are two different things. The pin in the bulletin board had made it real. That evening, Rachel found her sitting on the floor of their dorm room, her back against the bed, a half-empty mug of cold Earl Grey in her hands. "Okay," Rachel said, dropping her backpack by the door and kicking off her shoes. "You look like someone ran over your dog. What happened?" Amelia told her. The words came out flat and quiet like she was reading a news report. Rachel listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When Amelia finished, Rachel sat down on the floor across from her, cross-legged, and said, "So, are you going to tell her?" "Tell her what?" "That you wrote the poem. That you wrote all the poems. That you've been staring at her office door like it's the last lighthouse on the coast." Rachel leaned forward and poked Amelia's knee. "Girl, you need to do something about this." Amelia shook her head. "She's my TA. She's going to Oxford. The timing is terrible," Rachel agreed cheerfully. "It's always terrible."
"That's what makes it real. If you wait for perfect timing, you'll wait forever, and she'll be gone. And you'll be sitting in this same spot next year, drinking cold tea, and wondering what would have happened if you'd had the guts to say one honest thing." Amelia looked down at her mug. The tea had a thin film on top. She thought about Vivian's office door, the way the light fell through the blinds, the way Vivian's voice had softened, just slightly, when she said, "You're back." "She doesn't feel the same way," Amelia said quietly. "She can't. She's a person," Rachel said. "That's the thing you keep forgetting. She's not a marble statue. She's a person with a weird tea habit, and a face that does that thing when she's trying not to smile. I've seen it. You've seen it. She's not made of ice, Amelia. She just wants to look like she is." Amelia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I don't know if I'm brave enough." Rachel scooted closer and put her hand on Amelia's shoulder. "You wrote 12 lines about the way she stands by the window. You memorized which tea she drinks. You've been showing up to her office hours for weeks just to hear her say your name. That's not a lack of bravery, babe. That's a lot of bravery with nowhere to go." Amelia let out a shaky breath. "Just think about it," Rachel said gently. "The semester ends in 2 weeks. After that, she's either gone or she's not. But if you don't say anything, you'll never know. And I know you, Amelia. You other know." That night, Amelia lay in bed staring at the ceiling. She thought about the poem in her notebook, the one Vivian had read without meaning to. She thought about the way Vivian had looked at her that day, the way she had said, "We should talk," with something almost like tenderness. Underneath the formal words, she rolled over and pulled her phone from the nightstand. Her fingers moved before her brain could stop them, and she typed out a message to the one contact she had never used before. Vivian's number, saved from the workshop's group chat, with the little green dot next to it indicating she was online. Amelia stared at the screen for a long time. Then she typed, "Hi, I know this is random. Could we talk after class on the last day? Just for a few minutes." She hit send before she could change her mind. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She put the phone face down on the nightstand and closed her eyes, and she waited. Meanwhile, across campus, in a small office on the 3rd floor of the English building, Vivian was sitting at her desk with a stack of ungraded essays to her left and a printout of the fellowship announcement to her right. She had seen the notice that morning, same as everyone else. She had known the decision was coming. She had applied for the fellowship back in November, before the semester had gotten complicated, before a quiet student with earnest eyes and a notebook full of poems had started occupying an unreasonable amount of her thoughts. She had applied because it was the obvious next step. Oxford, a year abroad, a chance to finish her dissertation in an archive with better resources. It was sensible. It was impressive. It was everything she was supposed to want. But now, looking at the printout, she felt something twist in her chest. She picked up her phone. There was a message from a student in the workshop, Amelia, and Vivian's thumb hovered over it for a long time before she opened it. "Hi, I know this is random. Could we talk after class on the last day? Just for a few minutes?" Vivian, you rack it 3 times. Then she set the phone down, picked up her pen, and tried to go back to grading an essay about symbolism in The Great Gatsby. She got through 2 sentences before her eyes drifted back to the phone. She thought about the poem in Amelia's notebook, the one she had read by accident and could not forget. 12 lines about a woman who stood by the window during office hours, who drank mint tea and thought no one was watching. She thought about how it felt to be seen like that. She typed a reply, deleted it, typed another one, deleted that too. Finally, she wrote, "Okay, meet me in my office after the last workshop." She sent it, and then she put the phone in her desk drawer so she couldn't look at it anymore. Outside, the wind off Lake Michigan rattled the window. Vivian sat very still in the quiet of her office, a stack of ungraded essays in front of her, a fellowship announcement off to her right, and she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. She felt afraid. Not of the fellowship, not of Oxford. She was afraid of the fact that when she imagined leaving, the first thing she thought of was a pair of earnest eyes and a notebook full of poems she was not supposed to have read. She was afraid of how much she wanted to stay. The last workshop of the semester ended at 6. Students filed out in small groups, their voices echoing down the hallway, back-act zipping, goodbyes trailing into the stairwell. Amelia stayed in her seat until the room was empty.
Her fingers wrapped around the edges of her notebook, the one with the poem still tucked between its pages. She had not opened it in 3 days. She did not need to. She had memorized every line. The walk to Vivian's office was short. It had always felt long before, back when she was just a student walking to a meeting with a TA, but now the hallway seemed to shrink with each step. The door was slightly ajar. A line of warm light spilled onto the floor. Vivian was sitting at her desk, her round glasses on, a stack of essays in front of her. She looked up when Amelia knocked, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "Come in," Vivian said quietly. "Close the door." Amelia stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The latch clicked, and the sound felt final, like the closing of a chapter she had been too afraid to write. "Thank you for meeting me," Amelia said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I know you're busy. I know you have packing to do, and—" "Amelia," Vivian set down her pen. "Sit down." She sat in the chair across from the desk, the same chair she had sat in a dozen times before, but tonight it felt different. Tonight she was not here for feedback on a draft. She was not here to ask about a reading list or a grade. She was here to tell the truth. "I wrote it," Amelia said. Vivian's hands were still. "She does not pretend to misunderstand." "I know you did," Vivian said. "I knew the moment I saw it." Amelia's throat tightened. "You never said anything." "No." "Then why did you ask me to stay after class that day? If you knew, why didn't you just—" Amelia stopped, pressing her lips together. "I don't even know what I'm asking. I just know I've been carrying this for months, and I can't carry it anymore." Vivian leaned back in her chair. The lamp on her desk cast a warm glow across her face, softening the sharp lines she usually wore like armor. She looked tired, not in the way of a long day, but in the way of a long year. "It was about me," Vivian said. "The poem, it was about me, yes. The what? Think. Think. From this way, I sit by the window in my office, the way I stare out at the lake when I'm thinking, the way I tap my pen when I'm frustrated." Vivian's voice was low, almost wondering. "How did you notice all of that?" Amelia felt her face grow warm. "I notice everything about you." The words hung between them. Vivian did not look away. "That's a dangerous thing to say," Vivian said softly. "It's the truth." "The truth is dangerous too sometimes." Amelia swallowed. "I'm not scared of it anymore." Vivian was quiet for a long moment. Then she pulled off her glasses and set them on the desk, rubbing the bridge of her nose in a way that made her look younger, less like the ice queen the students whispered about, and more like a woman carrying something heavy. "I wrote a poem once," Vivian said. "It was about my grandmother's garden. She died when I was 19, and I never showed anyone what I wrote. I was too afraid." She looked at Amelia. "I'm still afraid. I've been writing for years, and I've never let anyone read a single word." Amelia's breath caught. "Why not?" "Because I showed someone once. A long time ago. I showed them a poem I had written, and they read it, and then they looked at me like I had become someone they didn't recognize. It was my family." Vivian's voice dropped. "I had just told them I was gay. I thought the poem might help them understand. Instead, they stopped talking to me, not just about the poem, about everything." The silence that followed was thick with years of unspoken pain. Amelia wanted to reach across the desk and take Vivian's hand, but she did not move. She did not want to push. She just waited. "I told myself after that," Vivian continued, "that it was easier to be alone, to be the person everyone was afraid of. Because if I got close, no one could decide I was too much or not enough." She let out a breath. "And then you sat in the back of my classroom, and you wrote a poem about the way I tap my pen." Amelia felt tears prick her eyes. "Vivian, I read it 12 times, Vivian said. "I read it so many times I could recite it in my sleep, and I kept telling myself I was reading it as a teacher, that I was analyzing your craft, your imagery, your line breaks." She shook her head. "But I wasn't. I was reading it because someone finally saw me, and I didn't know how to handle that." Amelia's voice broke. "I thought you were going to tell me to stop. I thought you were going to say it was inappropriate and ask me to never—" "I'm not going to ask you to stop." Vivian stood up. She walked around the desk, slowly, like she was approaching something fragile. She stopped a few feet away from Amelia's chair. "I applied for the Oxford Fellowship in November," Vivienne said. "Before I read a poem, before I started noticing the way you bite your pen cap when you're nervous, or the way you always sit by the window in the workshop, or the way you say, it's probably nothing, before you say something brilliant." Amelia looked up at her. "November was a long time ago," Vivienne said. "I've been telling myself that I still want to go, that it's just a year, that I'll come back and everything will be the same." She paused. "But I don't think I want to go anymore, and that terrifies me." "Why?" "Because it means I care about you more than I've allowed myself to care about anyone in years." Vivienne's voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability in it that Amelia had never heard before. "And caring about someone means they can hurt you. It means they can leave. It means they can look at you and decide you're not enough." "I would never." "You don't know that." Vivienne's voice softened. "You don't know that yet. And I don't know it either. That's the part that scares me. I can't control it. I can't plan for it. I can't write a draft and revise it until it's perfect." Amelia stood up. They were close now, closer than they had ever been without the barrier of a desk or a classroom between them. "I don't want perfect," Amelia said. "I want you. The real you. The one who writes poems about her grandmother's garden and never shows anyone." She reached out hesitantly and touched the edge of Vivienne's sleeve. "The one who put a whole page of notes on my final essay because she wanted me to know I was good enough." Vivienne's eyes were wet. "I don't know how to do this." "Neither do I," Amelia smiled, a small trembling thing. "But I've been writing poems about you for 6 months, and I've never been more scared of anything in my life. And I'm still here." Vivienne let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. "You're braver than I am. Maybe we can be brave together." The words settled between them, warm and tentative. Vivienne reached up and brushed a strand of hair from Amelia's face, her fingers lingering for just a moment. "I'm not going to Oxford," Vivienne said. "I'm staying." Amelia's tears spilled over. "Vivienne, I don't know what this is yet," Vivienne said. "I don't know where it goes, but I know I want to find out, and I know I want to find out with you." She pulled Amelia into an embrace, slow and careful, like she was holding something precious. Amelia buried her face in Vivienne's shoulder and felt her breathe, felt the steady rhythm of a heart that had been closed for so long finally opening. They stood like that in the quiet of the empty fesse, the lamp glowing, the stack of ungraded essays forgotten on the desk. Outside, the wind off Lake Michigan rattled the window, but neither of them moved. For the first time in years, Vivienne did not feel afraid of being seen, and for the first time in months, Amelia did not feel afraid of being wrong for wanting her. The semester ended the way semesters do, not with a dramatic closing door, but with a slow, quiet emptying. The hallways that had once buzzed with students and coffee cups and frantic last-minute questions grew still. The bulletin boards stopped filling with flyers. The classroom where Amelia had spent 15 weeks trying not to stare at Vivienne sat dark and empty, its chairs stacked, its whiteboard wiped clean. Amelia walked across campus on the first day of summer break with a cardboard box in her arms. Inside, her laptop, 3 notebooks, a mug she had left in the writing lab, and a folded copy of the syllabus from Vivienne's workshop, which she had kept, even though it was just a piece of paper. She had almost thrown it away twice. She was glad she hadn't. She found Vivienne sitting on the steps of the English building, reading a paperback with a cracked spine. She wore a faded denim jacket over a plain white t-shirt, and her dark hair was loose, catching the late afternoon sun. Amelia had never seen her without a cardigan or a blazer. It felt like seeing a different person, a softer one. "You look like a tourist," Amelia said, setting the box down. Vivienne looked up, and the smile that spread across her face was slow and unguarded. "I feel like one. I've lived in this city for 6 years, and I've never actually walked the lakeshore path. I always meant to. I just never had a reason." Amelia sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders must touched. "And now you do?" "Now I have a very compelling reason," Vivienne said. She closed her book and tucked it into her bag. "Her name starts with an A. She writes very good poems. She's sitting right next to me." Amelia felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "That's a pretty specific reason." "I'm a pretty specific person," Vivienne said.
Or so I've been told. Took me a long time to believe it. They walked to the lake together. The path was wide and flat, lined with old trees and benches worn smooth by decades of use. The water was a deep, clear blue, glittering in the late sun. A few joggers passed them, a family with a dog, a couple on a bike built for two, laughing at something neither of them could hear. Amelia told Vivian about growing up in a small town in Ohio, about the library where she had hidden during lunch breaks, about the teacher who had first told her she had a way with words. Vivian listened without interrupting, her hands in her pockets, her pace matching Amelia's exactly. Then Vivian told Amelia about the first poem she had ever written. She was 11. It was about a snow day. She had hidden it under her mattress for a month before showing her mother, who had said it was nice and then asked if she had done her math homework. "That was the last time I showed anyone anything for a long time," Vivian said quietly. "I kept writing. I just stopped letting anyone see." Amelia stopped walking. "But you showed me." Vivian turned to face her. The wind off the lake lifted a strand of hair across her face, and she tucked it behind her ear with a careful, almost nervous gesture. "You showed me yours first. That poem. The one in the notebook. You wrote it before I ever said a single vulnerable thing to you. You wrote it
before you even knew if I was worth it." Amelia shook her head. Worth it? Wasn't the question. I saw you. And I wanted you to know that someone did. Vivian was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was low, rough at the edges. No one has ever seen me like that before. Not my family, not the professors who praise my work, not the students who are scared of me. You looked at me and you saw the person behind the desk, the person who stares out the window and thinks about words she's too afraid to write down. You wrote them down eventually, Amelia said. You showed me. I did, Vivian said. Because you made it feel safe. You made me feel like being seen wasn't a risk. It was a gift. They stood there on the path, the lake stretching out behind them, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. Amelia reached out and took Vivian's hand. It was cold from the breeze, but she held on anyway. I'm glad you're staying, Amelia said. I'm glad you asked me to, Vivian said. I mean, you didn't exactly ask, you just stood in my office and told me you noticed everything about me, and that maybe we could be brave together. Which is not a subtle way to ask someone to stay. Amelia laughed, a bright, surprised sound. I was not subtle, I'm aware. Don't be sorry, Vivian said. Subtlety is overrated. I spent years being subtle. It got me exactly nowhere. They walked to the end of the path and back, and then they walked it again, because neither of them wanted to go home. They talked about everything and nothing. About the poem Vivian was revising, about the short story Amelia had started but couldn't finish, about the strange, wonderful feeling of being with someone who didn't require a performance. The sun dipped lower, turning the lake gold and pink and lavender. Vivian stopped at a bench and sat down, pulling a folded envelope out of her jacket pocket. I want to show you something, she said, before I lose my nerve. Amelia sat beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her shoulder. Vivian unfolded the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed with a title and a byline. I submitted a poem, Vivian said, to a small literary journal. The one I told you about. I've been sending it out for years, and always deleted the submission before hitting send. This time I actually did it. Amelia's breath caught. Vivian, that's incredible! Read the dedication, Vivian said softly. Amelia looked down at the bottom of the page. After the final line of the poem, there was a single typed line. To A, who taught me it's okay to be seen. Amelia's eyes filled with tears. She read it twice, then a third time, the words blurring. You dedicated it to me. Of course I did, Vivian said. You're the reason it exists. You're the reason I finally let it go. Amelia set the paper down carefully, like it was made of glass. Then she turned and wrapped her arms around Vivian, burying her face in the soft denim of her jacket. Vivian held her, one hand rising to rest lightly on the back of her head. I love it, Amelia whispered against her shoulder. I love that you did it. I love that you let me see. I love... She stopped, the word hanging in the air between them. Vivian pulled back just enough to look at her. The last light of the sun caught her eyes, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. You don't have to finish that sentence, Vivian said quietly. I already know, and I feel it too. Amelia laughed through her tears. You always know what I'm going to say. I've been
reading you for 15 weeks, Vivian said. You're not that hard to figure out. You're just hard to stop reading. The wind off the lake picked up, cool and clean. The sky deepened into a soft violet. A few stars began to appear, faint against the fading light. Amelia leaned her head against Vivian's shoulder, and Vivian's hand found hers again, warm and steady. They sat like that for a long time, watching the lake darken and the city lights begin to flicker on across the water. The poem you wrote about me, Vivian said eventually. The one in the notebook. Will you read it to me? The whole thing, not just the part I saw. Amelia looked up, surprised. You want me to recite it? I want to hear it in your voice, Vivian said. I've read it 12 times in my head. In my own voice, I want to hear it the way you meant it. Amelia pulled the notebook out of her bag. The pages were soft and worn now, dog-eared from being carried everywhere. She found the poem, the one she had written in the dark of her dorm room, the one that had started all of this. She took a deep breath and began to read. Her voice was quiet at first, then steadier. The words came out the way she had always wanted them to sound, not like a secret being confessed, but like a truth being spoken, out loud, into the open air, where it could finally be seen. When she finished, the lake was dark, and the stars were out in full. Vivian was crying, silent tears tracking down her cheeks, a soft, wondering expression on her face. That's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever written for me, she said. Amelia closed the notebook and set it aside. It was true, she said. Every word. Vivian reached out and cupped Amelia's face in her hands, gentle, careful, like she was holding something rare.
I spent so long being afraid of this, she said, of being seen, of being known, of being loved in a way that meant I couldn't hide anymore. And now? Vivian smiled, a real full smile, the one she kept for no one else. Now I think it might be the best thing that ever happened to me. She leaned in and pressed a soft, slow kiss to Amelia's forehead. Then she pulled back and took Amelia's hand, lacing their fingers together. Come on, she said. Let's walk back before it gets too dark to see the path. They walked hand in hand along the lake, the city lights warm and golden ahead of them, the stars bright above the water. Neither of them spoke, but they didn't need to. The silence was comfortable now, filled with everything they had already said and everything they had yet to discover. Summer had just begun, and for the first time in both of their lives, neither of them was in a hurry to get anywhere.
And that's where we leave their story. I'm always curious about who's listening. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? Drop your city in the comments below, and let me know if you've ever had a secret crush like this. See you in the next one.